Hello again, and welcome to another podcast. Now, obviously, wildlife photography is one of those things that I primarily do. That's the kind of photography I like to do. So I do feel like I talk about it quite a lot. But having said that, I thought it would be worth just doing another sort of review of just things to think about if you're photographing wildlife. So this might be the first time that you listen to one of these podcasts, or at least a podcast on this subject. Or maybe you've heard it before, but I also think that, well, certainly my experience is when I go over the same things a few times, each time I pick up something new. So I'm going to run through a few things to think about. Now, this is primarily with wildlife in mind, so that's really what I'm going to be talking about. However, these tips apply to almost any other type of photography. Some will be slightly different, depending on exactly what it is you're photographing. But as general tips go, these will certainly apply to some degree or another to pretty much any subject that you'd care to point a camera at. So, now the very first one I'm going to talk about is Aperture. And I'm a big believer in using modes on the camera. And the reason for that is that simply, if you select the correct mode for the type of photography that you're doing, the camera is already doing a lot of the work for you. Now, if you don't know what a mode is, I suggest you Google it or YouTube it or whatever. I do run courses where I run through absolutely all of this, assuming no knowledge at all. And frankly, if you are going to be doing this kind of photography, and I'll come back to this later, but you really need to know your camera. And if you don't know your camera, that's the best place to start. Just start by learning what the different aspects of the camera do, what impact they have on how much light you're getting through, how much of your picture is in focus, how much isn't, how do you control shutter speed, how do you control focus, how do you decide where the camera is going to set its exposure, because it will be looking at a certain point that you can see in the viewfinder and deciding that's what it's going to expose for. So anything that is exposed or lit differently to that point is likely to be overexposed or underexposed to a greater or lesser degree. So this basic stuff is really important, because if you don't know it, there's going to be, the best way of saying it, I suppose, a degree of chance in the outcome that you get. Because if you're lucky, the camera's set exposure to a point that's more or less right. Your depth of field is by chance what you need. But what I'm really about as a photographer is I want to control all of that. I want to be able to shoot that same image again and again and again with the right exposure, with the right depth of field, or maybe even vary my exposure and depth of field to get different results. But if you don't understand how that is done, then you're going to struggle. So this is why I'm a big believer in, at some point in your life, let's say as a photographer, you invest in a bit of training that's ground up training, assumes no knowledge. You'll probably hear things you already know, but there may well be things that you've missed. And you may well find that some pennies drop. You have some light bulb moments when now you understand why using a particular setting gives you a particular result. And this is absolutely fundamental. So if you're going to be doing anything that's remotely demanding as a photographer, and by that I'm thinking things like wildlife, like sports photography, moving objects, astro, even street photography, where you want creative control over your final result, you really, really have to know the camera basics and how to use them. So enough on that. So going back to wildlife, you need to, I tend to use aperture priority, because that controls, first of all, my depth of field, and depth of field allows you to visually isolate the subject from whatever's around it. And if you've got an animal that's in bushes, for example, so you've got things in the foreground, things in the background that incidentally can also interfere with focus. I'll talk to that. But you want to really make those foreground and background objects out of focus to some extent, so that the viewer's eye is drawn to your subject. Now, it may well be that you don't want to do that too. You might decide that you want everything in sharp focus for whatever reason, but that's the whole point of having these discussions, because you can control how to do that. And once you know how to do that, then you can choose exactly how you're going to compose that photograph. I've shot, my favorite photographs are to do kind of portraity shots where I get in as close as possible to the animal's face. And if there are things in the foreground, things in the background, I really want them out of focus to some extent, because that way you've got the out of focus parts of the scene, I suppose, that are there, and that creates depth so that the viewer can get a sense of depth, that this animal is not sitting out in the open or not right next to me. There are things in between, but equally their eye is continuously drawn back to the animal's face, and I normally set my focus on the eye that is nearest to me. That's the one I'll tend to focus on. So I'll talk more about that, but from the perspective of Aperture, you need to be able to control how much of the foreground and how much of the background is out of focus and to what extent it's out of focus. You might not want much out of focus, just a tiny bit, or you might want it really blurry. So all of this is down to how you use Aperture and understanding how all of that works, and knowing when to use a wide aperture, when to use a smaller aperture, because that all controls both your lighting and depth of field. So, second thing to think about is focus and shutter speed. So, one of the other important things to know is how your autofocus works and also how it's set up, because cameras usually give you maybe 4 different ways of determining autofocus. So you'll typically have 4 ways you can set it up. And in fact, there are other sort of variations against that, which will make it more than that if you're looking at the specific focal autofocus points that are being used. However, you do need to understand the basic settings. So one will be a kind of zone focus, where it's looking at everything in a central zone in your viewfinder or on your screen at the back of the camera. Or you want a single point, which is typically a single point somewhere in the autofocus area within the camera. Now, I tend to go for the central point just because it's easier to quickly get a focus that way. I'm not trying to remember which point I'm using. And that means that the camera will ignore everything that isn't within that little square. On the Canons I use, it's a little square in the center. So that means I can set a very precise focus. Now, something else to think about, and it's something I've been using for quite a while now, and that's a thing called back button focus. So if you don't know, when you are using your camera, when you press the shutter button halfway down, that's the point where the camera is taking a light reading to get the correct exposure, and it's setting the autofocus point. So back button focus basically takes that autofocus function away from the shutter button and puts it onto another button on the camera, normally on the back. A lot of cameras, so my Canons do this, but the buttons on the back of the body, so the opposite side to the lens, some of them can be reprogrammed to have a different function. Now, you're going to have to look at the camera that you own, that you're using, and see if that's possible. But a commonly used function is what we call back button focus. So as the name implies, you're setting your focus using a button on the back of the camera. And the advantage of that is you can set that once. And then when you press the shutter button again, if you have moved slightly and that sort of central autofocus point is now on something you don't want to focus on, the camera will ignore it because you're not pressing the back button focus button, you're simply pressing the shutter button down again. So it means you can set a focal distance. Obviously, with the aperture you've selected, you have a sort of a certain box, if you think of it that way, that will actually be in focus. It's a certain distance from you and your camera. It's also a certain depth. And that's the sort of in focus box, if you want to think of it that way. And you can control how deep that box is by changing your aperture. And from there, you can start producing creative photographs. So knowing your autofocus is really important. Now, another thing that more modern cameras have, not all of them, and a lot of new cameras now are quite expensive, as far as I can see, but a lot of them have tracking functions. So if you're on continuous autofocus, So again, autofocus is typically either a single press and then it holds focus, or it's continuous. So while you keep your finger, let's say we're on the shutter button or on the back button, focus button, whichever button you're using, while you keep that button depressed, the shutter button halfway down, the camera will continuously refocus. So if you are trying to photograph a subject that is either moving towards you or away from you, obviously the focal distance, the distance between you and that subject, is constantly changing. So you need the camera to keep up with that. Now, some of the newer cameras, and again, mirrorless included, and it might be all, I don't know, so I'm not going to make a blanket statement that is most likely wrong. But what they can do is actually track. You tell it what you want to focus on, which might be the face of an animal, let's say, and then the camera will continuously track and refocus on that particular subject that you've told it to focus on. So that is a really cool feature that a lot of the newer cameras have. Definitely in the pro camera range, if you're spending a bit more on your camera, you would expect to have that kind of capability. And that is really useful because it means that whole focusing job is taken away from you, and you can think a lot more, concentrate a lot more on composition and how you want the animal to look within the frame. Now, I'm going to come to composition in a moment, but the next thing I want to talk about is just lenses. So I always use a long lens. My go-to lens is a 100 to 400 mil, and I use both full frame and a cropped frame sensor. So the difference with a cropped frame is that you effectively add an amount of zoom onto the image compared to what you'd get on the full frame. If you can't get your head around that, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal, but the important thing is to have a long focal length because that allows you to get in really close. And one of the things that I think is important when you're doing wildlife photography, particularly if you're shooting photographs you want to share with people, is that they get to see the animal in a way perhaps they wouldn't normally see themselves, or it'd be very difficult for them to see without any kind of help themselves. So I like to do portraits. However, it's also useful sometimes to do more of a kind of setting type photograph. You take a wide angle shot with the animal in its natural environment. And you might want to make all sorts of visual comments about that situation. So I'm not going to get into the visual storyteller in this podcast, but it's something that I use as a technique when I'm deciding particularly how to compose my shot. But I think it is nice rather than have a lot of, endless close-ups, which is just brilliant. But sometimes it's also nice to have more of a contextual shot so you can see the sort of environment that particular animal likes to be in. So that's something to think about there. But you definitely want a good long telephoto lens and ideally a zoom lens. Now, the downside to a zoom lens is it's not as fast, so your aperture is more limited. That means for a given focal distance, you're likely to have a slower shutter speed, which means you have to compensate in other ways. Now, if the animal isn't moving, that's not such a big deal, but if you're in a situation where the animal is moving, that can become an issue. If you're in a situation where there's not very much lighting, let's say you're in a forest somewhere and most of the light is kind of most of what you're getting is in shadow because of the tree canopy, then that can mean you're shooting, it might be blazing sunshine outside this tree canopy, but within it, it's actually quite dark. So a fast lens is great, and fixed focal length lenses definitely give you, in most cases, a sharper photograph with access to higher shutter speeds than you would get with a zoom. But the downside is what focal length you want, because there are definitely situations, although the 400 is great and I use that a lot, I have taken many, many photographs without using that zoom and its full zoom. And sometimes I want to pull right the way back to 100 because there's a few other things going on that I want in that frame, that I want in that story. So I think, in my opinion, the 100-400 is the best compromise because it gives you a good focal length. You can zoom in to quite a large degree, and you can vary the focal length very easily. Weight-wise, yeah, it's certainly the lenses I use, they're more the pro lenses. They've got multiple glass elements in them, and they're metal, so they get quite heavy. So you need to think about that if you're going to be hiking with them over a long distance, which I've definitely done with my lens and my lenses actually. So your choices are, if you are going to hike, either take a different lens or do a bit of training. Walking training, weight training, whatever it is, just so that you're more comfortable carrying something that's heavy over a longer distance. And I say this only half in jest, because as I record this, I've just come back a little while ago from just a 10K walk, which is part of training I'm doing for a trip to Namibia in a few weeks. And that's the 10K walk is the short one. And that's with the full backpack, or the backpack that I'll be carrying, my water, my camera, all of that stuff. So I get used to carrying that weight over those sort of distances. So these are just things to be aware of. And obviously these are things to think about when you're taking your kit. If you are going somewhere remote, other things to think about are batteries for your camera. If you've got a mirrorless, that's more important, because you're much more likely to be draining. You're going to be draining the battery much faster than you will with the DSLR. So do you have spare batteries you can carry? Is there any way to recharge your batteries? I've tried solar before now. It was sort of mixed results, if I'm perfectly honest, a small portable solar panel kit, but that was 5 years ago. So hopefully the technology has improved quite a lot. If you have a support vehicle of some sort, you've got access to a USB. If you're going to places where it's a proper safari vehicle, often they will have an inverter in them, so you can get to a mains plug and use your regular charger if that's another possibility. When you are using your mains charger, by the way, just one thing to mention: if you have any way of protecting that charger from an over voltage, that is a good idea. So what I mean by that is, if you've got an iffy electricity supply, it's not nice and smooth, but it tends to have big spikes of voltage in it. What can happen if you're unlucky, and it happened to me once in India, is that one of these big spikes come through and it absolutely burns out the charger. It does something to the transformer, or I don't know, melts connection, does whatever. But basically, I know that I was in India and suddenly my charger wasn't working anymore and it was just completely dead. So if you are likely to be using mains voltage, if you can take, it might be one of these 4-socket extender things with over voltage protection. Anything that gives you over voltage protection is useful. It's another thing to carry, but it's far better to have to carry that than to lose your charger, because if that's the only option you've got, that can be quite difficult. So I've got a USB charger. It's not quite as good as the mains charger, but USB is low voltage. It's 5 volts or thereabouts. Whereas depending on where you are, mains voltage could be 240, 230, 110, whatever. And obviously if you get a spike on top of that kind of a voltage, you're much more likely to do damage to your kit. So something to think about. Okay, so have a good lens. If it has one of these nifty autofocus capabilities, that is really good. That might be a function of the lens, might be a function of the camera, depending on what you're using, but that is definitely useful. Another thing I'm going to just mention is teleconverters, because I've seen them recommended as at least something to think about. Now, I tried in Namibia a few years ago. I took a teleconverter with me and I popped it onto my 100 to 400 because it allowed me to, it was a ×2. And a teleconverter, if you don't know, it basically sits between the camera body and the lens, and it multiplies that lens focal length, if you like, by an amount. It's usually either 2 or 1.4. Might be slightly different for your kit, but they're the two that I know for Canon. So in theory, that's really cool, because instead of carrying a 100 to 400, I'm now carrying a 200 to 800 mm lens, which is really amazing. However, there are some downsides. So the first one is that it generally reduces the amount of light getting through to the sensor by about 1 stop. You'll need to check the actual specs on the teleconverter you're thinking about or using if you are using one, but be aware it will reduce the light getting through by a certain amount. And that can have a serious impact on your fastest shutter speed because it might reduce it to a point where it's no longer useful. Now, the other thing with using a teleconverter and having that kind of focal length is that the smallest wobble, if you're hand holding, that will come through onto the shot, almost guaranteed. So you're having to think about either somewhere to rest the camera where it absolutely won't move or use a tripod to use that kind of focal length. So that's one of the problems. The other problem can be that some of the functions where the camera body needs to be talking to the electronics in the camera lens, some of them don't work. So that might be autofocus might disappear, things like that. So that's more likely to be true if you buy a teleconverter from a third party supplier or you're using a lens from a third party. So by a third party, I just mean someone who isn't the manufacturer of the camera. So if you've got a Canon camera with a Sigma lens, who knows, and you've got a Canon teleconverter. I don't know. It may work, it may not, but just be aware of that. So if you're thinking about it, look, I would think carefully. I think you may well find that you take it and then you don't use it. I don't find them particularly useful. I think they're probably much better suited where you can park the whole thing on a tripod and then you can make full use of that big focal length without worrying about camera wobble and getting blur into your camera. Excuse me. Right, so I'm just having a short drink there. Okay, so what else? The other thing I'm going to talk about in terms of the photography part is to just be aware of composition. So obviously, there are various ways you can compose the image. If you're going to do a portrait, are you going to slap the animal's face right in the middle? Are you going to put it off to one side? How are you using space in the picture? Are you using leading lines? Are you using rules of thirds? There are many different ways to compose a picture. So it's always good to have a few ideas in the back of your mind when you're going off to shoot things. Sometimes you have to just shoot really fast to get the action, to freeze the action. So obviously that's thing number one. If you don't get a shot that's frozen the action or got what you need in it, then you haven't really got anything. So number one is to make sure that you've set up so you've, say, got an animal, maybe eyeing up some prey or whatever it's doing, and you've set the depth of field so that the background's out of focus, foreground's out of focus, so your eyes are drawn, and the viewer's eyes are drawn to the animal and maybe the prey animal. How you compose that, though, where are they in the frame? Are they high, low, one side or the other? All that sort of stuff you need to think about, and because each of them will have a different impact on the look and feel of the final image. Are you shooting in landscape format or are you shooting portrait? Again, very different use of space and use of the area within the frame to put your subject and then anything else that's there. Now, speaking about anything else that is there, be very conscious of distractions. Now, the thing is, if you're shooting really fast, you might not have time to look. So it's then really important that when you're looking at the image in post, so when you're in Photoshop or whatever you're using. Now, I do this with almost every photograph I take. Certainly everything that I share, that always goes through post-processing, because it allows me to reformat or just move things around a little bit. And by that, within the frame, I don't mean do an awful lot of editing. I just mean just recrop so that I've got my subject or subjects where I want them in the frame. But also it's a way of just getting rid of anything that shouldn't be there. So it might be the back end of another animal that just happened to be in the way when you took the shot. So things like that. So just be conscious of distractions that might distract from the subject. Because ultimately with these photographs, the idea of the composition is that you take the viewer's eye on a journey through the photograph and show them the things you want to show them, not something else that happened to wander into frame and now you've got to do something with it. So do have a good look at the at composition and have a think about that, and maybe look at other people's work, maybe on Instagram or elsewhere, but particularly photographers whose work you love. Look at what they're doing, what sort of composition are they using, are they using light in a certain way, are they shooting at different times of day, all that sort of thing. So this also brings me on to really the final thing, which is research. And the two aspects of that are know your camera. And so I've already spoken about a few things you really need to know when it comes to thinking about your camera, but do lots of practice. And the thing I always recommend people to do if you're going to be shooting something like wildlife is to photograph birds, because we don't all have access to wildlife where we live. But most of us do have access to birds. So birds can be quite tricky to shoot, particularly if they're flying. And if they're flying with, say, sky behind them, and then they fly across in front of a building because you just changed what's in the background. So it's an opportunity to get familiar with how you're using depth of field, how you're using shutter speed, how you're using your focus. It just allows you to practice everything. And then in post, you can look at just recropping to get a different feel to the image, tell the story that you want to tell, all that sort of thing. So the first aspect of, let's call it research, is to really know your camera and practice the kind of photography that you're likely to be doing, especially if you're going on a vacation or a trip somewhere that it's not easy to go back again if you mess everything up. And the other thing to do is to know your subject. So know when they're active, know what to expect at different times of day. Is it different times of the year? So do all of that stuff so that you know what you can expect. And the final thing, I'm just looking here, is multiple shots. So when you're photographing, I knew I'd forget something, but do take a lot of photographs and try different angles if you can, but never rely on just one image. It may be that you shoot 20 or 30 and you just use one out of that, but that's fine, because the more you shoot, the more variety you're likely to have. I do high-speed bursts when I do mine, and so I'll set everything up with possibly an in-focus box, so I know animals are going to be in that, and that's what I'll just fire away at. And sometimes where I've got a group of animals moving very quickly, it's just impossible to set up the shot for an individual animal. They're just going too quickly. So I'm thinking of things like impala in Southern Africa and things like dolphins. So they're generally moving so fast you can't photograph an individual. So the thing to do is just to set up a focus box that you know they're going to go into, and then just hold that shutter button down and take a lot of photographs. Okay, and then the final thought to leave you with is just to respect the animals and their environment. Don't do anything to upset them. Don't stress them. You're a visitor to their home. Perhaps consider it that way. And don't leave a mess. The old saying is, take only photographs, leave only footprints. And I think that's a really good way to approach wildlife photography. So be very respectful of the animals, be very respectful of the environment they're in, and take your photographs, enjoy that time spent in the wilderness, presumably it's wilderness, with whatever animals it is you're with, and just enjoy that whole experience, everything you can see, smell, hear, taste, whatever it might be, and just fully enjoy that experience. But when you're finished, just leave it as if you were never there. Okay, so that's it for this podcast. I hope that's been useful, and I will speak to you again on the next podcast. So bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.